The loaded crossbow was heavy in my hands as I moved through the woods. I was losing strength about as fast as I was losing daylight. And as daylight faded, so did my chances of finding the girl. He'd taken her. He'd taken her and was going to do God knows what with her. The last time I'd seen them, he'd been carrying the girl over his shoulder, heading through the woods toward the hill. But now, there was no sign of them. The girl was no longer screaming. Maybe he'd knocked her out. Maybe he'd killed her. I thought about turning around, about heading down the trail to my Suburban and taking myself to a hospital. I glanced down at the crossbow bolt sticking out of my abdomen, just above my left hip. It was hurting more with every step I took, and bleeding more too. I moved toward the top of the gently sloping hill as the last of the day died slowly, killed by the encroaching night. It was full dark by the time I reached the top of the hill. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, thanks to the cloud cover and the trees blocking any light from the cosmos. I resisted the urge to take out my phone and use its flashlight function. I wanted my eyes to adjust. Finally, after several long minutes, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, allowing me to see about 20 feet in any direction. It wasn't much of an improvement, but it was something. I continued along the top of the wooded hill. The West Virginia mountains still loomed over me, only adding to the claustrophobia pressed upon me by the darkness. As I leaned against a dead oak tree to look down at my wound, I heard something off in the distance. It sounded like a door shutting. I moved toward where I thought the source of the sound was, soon seeing a large, dark square sitting in the distance. A house. A scream erupted from my right, sending my heart into my throat. I whipped the loaded crossbow that way, seeing a large woman with a cleaver running toward me. She screamed, her eyes bulging from between the folds of fat that encompassed her face. She wore a muumuu and moved quicker than her bulk should have allowed, holding the cleaver up, ready to strike. I pulled the trigger on the crossbow. The weapon kicked in my hands as the bolt sailed from the arrow track. Although I'd been aiming at her chest, the bolt entered her wide-open mouth, strangling her scream as it punched into the back of her throat. But she didn't stop. She didn't even slow. She kept coming. I backpedaled and ran into a tree trunk, bringing the crossbow up to ward off the cleaver. She was strong, and she chopped down on the crossbow, causing my arms to buckle. The top edge of the cleaver dug into my forehead and dragged down toward my nose. I struggled to get her off me as the cleaver tore my face open. I'm going to die, I thought. This woman's going to kill me. She kept pushing the cleaver, dragging it down my face. I screamed. "This is it," I said, putting the Suburban in park. The pale, early afternoon sunlight slanted through the tree branches. Barren oak trees allowed sunlight to reach the ground for probably the first time all year in some places. In other places, the still green needles of Virginia pine trees soaked up the sun, photosynthesis silently pumping oxygen into the air. I stepped out into the small dirt clearing and inhaled deeply, breathing in the West Virginia air. Norman, who stepped out of the vehicle and shut the rear passenger door, did the same. He looked around with apparent appreciation. "Are you joking with this one?" Roger asked as he got out on the other side of the Suburban. "Is this even a hiking trail? I don't see any marker." "It's a trail, all right," I said. "I have a feeling you're going to hate it, old man." "I'm only 5 years older than you," Roger said. "But I feel I must say that if I die out here, you two will be the ones to haul my leathery carcass out of there. Oh, and you'll be the one to tell my wife, Greg." He leveled a finger at me over the hood. I twisted my face into a terrified sneer. "Well, I guess we better keep you alive. Otherwise she'll skin me like one of her deers." Norman, who'd been standing silently nearby, chuckled. It sounded like a far-off rumble of thunder. The big man was in a good mood. We took turns finding new places to hike, having long ago gotten bored of all the places around our hometown of Winchester, Virginia. We always tried to outdo each other, finding harder and harder hikes for the sheer pleasure of torturing one another. And this one looked to be plenty hard. The craggy West Virginia mountains loomed large over us, creating a strange sense of claustrophobia that I'd only ever experienced in this part of the country. It was odd to feel claustrophobic in the great outdoors. I looked over the hood at Roger, who was looking around with mild concern on his face. I could tell he was feeling the presence of the mountains in this narrow valley. I smiled and headed to the back of the SUV to grab our gear. We grabbed our day packs, strapped them on, and got ready for the hike. It was 12 miles out and back, not a long distance for us, but the elevation climb would be the true killer. From what I'd read about the little-known trail, it was a brutal one, even for experienced hikers. When we were all set to go, I locked up the Suburban and headed toward the trailhead. Roger was right. It wasn't marked at all. But I figured maybe there would be a sign further on, as I'd seen on some trails before.
I'm looking at a new car,
Roger said as we started off.
Well, new to me anyway. What kind?
Norman asked in his deep voice. He took up the rear, with Roger between us.
I found a nice Lexus ES 350 with only 60,000 miles on it,
Roger said.
Good price, too. Those things are silent as the grave when you drive them. Some people say they've even had to question whether the engine is on, they're so quiet.
Sure would beat the hell out of your old Honda,
I said.
That thing is loud as hell. Might as well not have any windows at all. Although I'm not sure Norman would appreciate being crammed in a sedan.
What do you think, big man?
Roger asked.
Could you make it work?
I'll sit shotgun, Norman said with a smile in his voice.
Greg can sit in the back.
Fine with me,
I said. Norman had always been big, ever since high school. He was 6'5" and nearly 250 now, 30 years on. He'd managed to keep in shape, better shape than me or Roger. Probably because he worked out between our weekly hikes. Straight out of high school, Norman and I had started working for a construction company where we'd met Roger. Being older, he'd taken us under his wing to show us the ropes at work. Outside of work, he'd bought us beer and kept us from getting into much trouble. We'd all been fast friends ever since. Of course, as we all grew older and more mature, the beer drinking sessions were gradually replaced by hikes, at least in part. We still got together for a good night of drinking on special occasions. The first 4 miles passed as we chatted, but things started getting a little tougher, so the talking was replaced by heavy breathing. The trail ran next to a small creek, and the fall weather was just about perfect for hiking once we started warming up with the activity.
This isn't so bad,
Roger said after a little while.
I thought you said this was a difficult hike.
just wait,
I said.
Besides, I can hear you huffing and puffing from up here.
Roger grumbled something I couldn't quite hear, and Norman chuckled his rumbly chuckle again. The trail leveled out for a bit as we came to a clearing. It seemed like a good place for a break. I slung my backpack off and unzipped it to grab a protein bar and my water bottle. Roger and Norman did the same, and soon we were all standing around in the pale, cloud-filtered sunlight, eating and drinking. A commotion in the woods at the edge of the clearing caught our attention. I turned to look that way, expecting to see a deer bounding away from us, having been spooked by our presence. But what I saw was something so unexpected that it took me a moment to realize it was really happening. A young girl, about 14 or 15, burst into the clearing from the woods. She had dirty blonde hair and wore a ragged dress that had once been tan but was now a colorless, shapeless rag that hung from her thin and bony shoulders like it was hanging from a clothes hanger. The bottom of the dress billowed around her skinny, pale legs as she ran toward us. Her eyes were fixed on us, and even from 40 or 50 yards away, I could see the terror in them. The three of us stood like wax statues, watching this girl sprint toward us. I don't know what Roger and Norman were thinking, but the jumble of thoughts in my mind was like a rancid stew made from the most horrible aspects of humanity. It was clear that this girl had been abused, and the sight of her sent my guts into knots as surely as if I'd eaten some of that poison stew. But as she got closer and I saw the bruises on her arms, legs, and face, something other than desolation took hold in my twisting guts. It didn't take long for me to recognize it as anger. Then she was coming nearer, slowing down, a look of distrust on her face. Now that she was closer, I could see that she had no shoes on. Her feet were dirty and bleeding, thanks to the rocky terrain. I got down to one knee and held out what was left of my protein bar.
It's okay,
I said.
we won't hurt you.
She came to a stop 10 yards away from me, brown eyes jumping from face to face as she considered her next move.
Bessie!
A man shouted from the woods behind the girl. The girl? Was Bessie her name? I flinched and looked back at the woods from which she had just emerged. She whipped her head back around and looked at me, hope fighting the terror in her eyes. A man in a threadbare black Slayer t-shirt and holey jeans crashed from the woods, freezing as he saw the four of us in the clearing. But he only froze for a second. A smile came onto his compact face, and he ran a hand through his greasy brown hair as he walked toward us.
Thank the Lord,
He said in a heavy Appalachian accent.
you found her.
I stood up and looked at the man.
No!
The girl cried, coming over and getting behind me, her little hands clinging to my shirt.
No, him! No, please!
The man kept coming with that smile on his face. He raised a hand in greeting.
How are you folks today?
I looked at Roger on my right and Norman on my left as they stepped up, the three of us creating a barrier between the man and the girl.
What's going on?
Roger asked. The man flapped a hand.
Just some family drama. You know how teenagers can be, don't you?
This is your daughter?
I asked.
Yep, that's my daughter, Bessie. She looks like she's starving.
Roger said.
Don't you feed her?
The man's smile faltered. A flash of deep, dangerous anger came across his face.
I think we got off on the wrong foot here.
He said, stepping forward and extending one dirty hand.
I'm Wayne.
We all looked at his hand, but none of us stepped to take it. Wayne dropped his hand after a moment.
Listen, fellas, this is a family matter. You have no right to mess with my family. It's none of your business, frankly. Now just allow me to collect my daughter and we'll be on our way home. You live nearby?
Roger asked. Wayne nodded once.
That's right.
Where?
I don't think that's any of your business either.
What's your last name? I asked. Wayne glared at me.
Step aside,
He said.
and let me collect my daughter. No, him.
The girl said, still clinging to me.
Doesn't look like your daughter wants to go with you.
I said.
Don't matter what she wants. She's a minor, and she's my daughter. Now step aside.
I think we need to get the authorities involved.
I said. Any pretense of brotherly spirit fell from Wayne's face. His brown eyes seemed to dim toward black as he stared at me. When he moved fast, darting toward me with the fist ready to deliver a blow. Norman moved even quicker, pushing the smaller man to the ground. I had to lean to my right to see past Norman's bulk as he stood in front of me, looming over Wayne on the ground. Wayne looked up at him with stark hate.
You just fucked up.
Wayne said.
You all just fucked up big time. Get the hell out of here before I break you in half.
Norman said. He wasn't one for empty threats. He meant it. Wayne crab-walked backward and then got to his feet when he was out of Norman's reach. He spoke as he walked backward toward the woods.
My family has lived in these mountains for generations. I know them better than anyone, and you just fucked with the wrong man.
He tripped over a rock and nearly fell on his ass. Roger and I chuckled, which only served to make Wayne even madder. He turned and disappeared into the woods.
Well, I guess this hike's over.
Roger said, turning to look at Bessie.
Yeah,
I said.
let's get the hell out of here before he comes back.
We all checked our phones and found that we didn't have service, which wasn't really a surprise up in these mountains. But it was dismaying nonetheless. The three of us discussed our plan, which mostly meant Roger and I hashing it out with the occasional nod from Norman. Meanwhile, Bessie sat on the ground munching a full protein bar I'd produced from my day pack. She gobbled the bar down and chugged a bunch of water from my bottle before I stopped her. remembering something about how starving people shouldn't eat or drink too much at one time. And by the looks of Beshi, she was close to starvation. Her arms and legs were rail thin, and not in a healthy way that some gangly teenagers have been known to exhibit. The plan was to take Beshi to the nearest police station, but we had nearly 5 miles between us and my Suburban. I knelt next to the girl and looked into her eyes. She returned my gaze, seeming to study me with a childlike wonder I'd only ever seen in children much younger than her.
We're going to take you somewhere safe,
I said.
How does that sound?
She nodded.
Please?
Can you walk?
She nodded again.
Okay.
I got to my feet and reached a hand out to her. She looked at it, got to her feet without it, then looked me in the eye again. I thought it was her way of telling me how strong she was. I liked her for that. It was clear she'd been through hell, and she still had a source of strength deep inside to draw upon. She was a tough girl, that much was clear. As we were about to start off, I looked at her bloody bare feet. A glance at my boots told me that they wouldn't fit her, not even close. Norman saw me looking and stepped over, holding his backpack out toward me. I took it and said,
Thanks.
I put his pack on so I was carrying it on my chest while carrying my pack on my back. Norman got down on his knees next to the girl and reached one large hand around to pat his back.
Up on,
he rumbled. Beshi looked at me. I nodded. She stepped behind Norman and climbed onto his back, clasping her hands together at his collarbone. He stood up as though she weighed nothing at all. I thought it wasn't far off, considering how thin she was. We headed down the trail, me in the rear with Norman and Beshi in the middle, and Roger taking the lead. As we came to the edge of the clearing, I glanced at the shadowy woods where Wayne had gone. I looked for any sign of movement, but saw none. Still, I had a feeling we were being watched. I just hoped I was being paranoid. As soon as I found out, I wasn't being paranoid enough. We'd gone about a mile when Roger said,
what the hell is that?
We stopped, and I stepped off the trail to see past Norman and Beshi. A rather large pine tree was lying across the trail some 20 yards ahead. The bushy branches blocked our view of the trail on the other side. The skin on the back of my neck tightened as I peered at the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of Wayne. No way this could be a coincidence.
I guess we're going around,
Roger said, starting ahead. As Norman got moving, Beshi started freaking out.
No, please,
She screamed.
no!
Roger and Norman stopped, and Beshi quit screaming. I came around and looked into her face.
What is it? What's wrong?
Please,
She said.
no.
That seemed to be the extent of her vocabulary.
We can't just stay here.
Roger said.
We gotta go.
Yeah, I said, still looking at Beshi, trying to figure out what she wanted.
I'll go check it out.
Roger said.
See what's ahead.
Okay, I said. Be careful. Roger took a moment to grab one of his aluminum trekking poles out of his backpack. He unfolded it and clicked the pieces together, much like the rods on a camping tent. He held it up like a baseball bat, swinging it once in the air as if to test it. He turned to us and shrugged.
Better than nothing. I can go,
Norman said.
You stay right the hell there and protect that girl?
Roger said.
I'll be fine. We're talking about some peckerhead redneck, not Arnold Schwarzenegger.
He started toward the tree, prompting Beshi to say,
No!
again.
It's okay, Missy.
Roger said.
It's okay.
The left side of the trail wasn't passable, so Roger went to the right of the downed tree, heading for a narrow space between the trunks of 2 upright pine trees. He would have to duck slightly to get under the branches, but it seemed like the best route around the downed pine. As he stepped between the trees, I heard something shift. He looked down at his feet and said,
What the?
Something came flying at him from the other side of the 2 trees, and he grunted as it hit him. Roger stumbled back toward us, dropping his trekking pole and using his left hand to do something up near his chest. It was only when he turned around that I got a glimpse of what had hit him. It was a block of wood that had spikes sticking out of it. Nails, it looked like. Roger hurried toward us, gripping his right arm above the elbow with his left hand. As he got closer, I noticed the blood coming through his lightweight green hiking shirt.
Bastard set a booby trap,
Roger said with a nervous laugh. I set both backpacks I was carrying on the ground and opened mine to get the small first aid kit I always carried with me. While I was at it, I got my pocket knife out of the bag and put it in my pocket.
Norman, can you put the girl down and keep an eye out?
I asked.
Yes.
Norman said, setting Beshi down next to me and then walking carefully over to retrieve Roger's trekking pole. I had Roger remove his backpack, sit down, and unbutton his shirt so I could see the damage. It wasn't good, but it wouldn't kill him. He had 8 holes in the upper side of his chest, right arm, and shoulder from where the spiked weapon hit him. They were all bleeding pretty good. If it hadn't been for his backpack strap blunting some of the impact, it would have been considerably worse. Concern for my friend mixed with anger at Wayne. I was going to enjoy seeing his ass go to prison for what he'd done to Beshi and Roger. I couldn't wait to get to a police station and tell them what we knew. I felt a sick joy at the thought of ruining Wayne's life for good. I cleaned the wounds and bandaged them up as best I could with the supplies from the small first aid kit. It would do until we got back to civilization. Once done, I turned to Norman.
See anything?
I asked.
No,
he said. I turned back to Beshi, who was looking at me with the wide, frightened eyes of a beaten puppy.
Do you think you can look out for more of these traps?
She seemed to consider that for a moment before nodding.
Good. I just want you to say no when you see one, okay? Say no and point to it. Can you do that?
Beshi nodded again.
You think you can walk?
I asked Roger.
hell, my legs are fine. Of course I can walk,
he said. I smiled, glad to see that his personality was intact.
What about you?
I asked Beshi.
Can you walk for a while?
She nodded and grabbed my hand. A minute later, we were moving carefully through the gap in the trees. I saw the tripwire that had sprung the trap. It was a thin piece of fishing wire among the weeds between the 2 pines. Once we were on the other side of the fallen tree, we got back on the trail and continued toward the Suburban. Norman took the lead, once again wearing his own backpack. He still had one of Roger's trekking poles. Meanwhile, Roger had his other in his left hand, ready to use it as a weapon if need be. Beshi and I walked at the rear, hand in hand. The group took it slow, searching for more tripwires along the trail. Whenever we came to a narrow spot where the branches hung low or a boulder blocked our view around the bend, we would stop and let Beshi look at the trail from afar, searching for any telltale sign of a booby trap. It took us nearly 40 minutes to go less than a mile. The sun was getting low, and a chill was seeping into the air. The last thing I wanted was to be out here when it got dark. But I also didn't want to step into a hole filled with spikes or any other booby trap. When we'd gone a mile from the booby trap and hadn't seen anything else that would indicate another trap, we started to pick up the pace. We slowed as we moved into a section where shelves of sandstone rock loomed on both sides of the trail. We all had our heads down, studying the trail for tripwires. When a sound like a grunt came from up above, I looked up to see a basketball-sized boulder falling from the cliff top on our left. My heart seized in my chest as I cried out, "Norm!" Norman looked up a second before the boulder crashed into his face with a savage crunch. His head snapped backward with the impact, and he fell off the trail into the little creek bordering it. The boulder rolled to a stop nearby as the sound of the impact lingered in the air. Norman didn't move at all. His face had been smashed in and was nothing but a bloody mess. I was certain he was dead.
Look out!
Roger said, turning and shoving Beshi and me back up the trail as another, smaller boulder came sailing down. The rock bounced off the trail a foot behind Roger. The 3 of us ran up the trail and didn't stop until we were in some woods a good 100 yards from that narrow alley of rock cliffs.
He means to kill us all,
Roger said, catching his breath.
that motherfucker.
A crunching sound came from the forest. Roger and I whipped our heads that way, looking into the trees and seeing nothing. But he was out there. Wayne was out there, waiting until he could get the drop on us again.
Fuck this.
Roger said, slinging his backpack down. He looked at me.
Let's go get this asshole.
The anger inside was barely containable now. It trumped any fear I had. I pictured the way Wayne had looked on the ground after Norman shoved him down like a child. I wanted nothing more than to bash his face in with a rock. So I agreed, putting my backpack down and looking Beshi in the eye. "You stay here," I said. "If you see Wayne, scream and run away. We'll come for you."
No,
Beshi said, grabbing my hand in both of hers.
no, please.
"It's okay," I told her. "We have to do this. We'll be back soon." As Roger and I moved off into the woods, I pulled my pocket knife out and flipped the blade open. Roger had his trekking pole, which he had held like a sword in his left hand. I glanced back at the trail. Beshi stood there, staring after us, sucking on her right thumb. Roger and I moved deeper into the woods, scanning the trees for any sign of Wayne. When I looked back again, I could no longer see Beshi. The trail was blocked from view by trees and shrubs. A crunch of leaves in the woods had Roger and I turning toward a small group of pine trees. We peered at the mess of pine needles, blocking any view beyond. A few of the branches moved, bulging outward as though pushed from behind. Roger was slightly ahead of me and to my right, and we both leaned forward, squinting to see what was poking through the trees. Something small shot out of the branches, moving too fast for me to see. Roger grunted and stumbled back. As he came abreast of me, I saw what had come through the branches. It was a carbon fiber arrow, and it stuck out of his chest. He fell to the ground and looked up at the dimming sky through the skeletal oak branches overhead. A growl escaped my throat as I turned toward the group of pine trees. It turned into a cry of anger and determination as I sprinted forward, arms and legs pumping, knife blade glinting dimly in the remaining daylight. I burst through the tree branches, seeing Wayne with a crossbow in his hands. It had a scope and a pistol grip, the kind of weapon that costs upwards of $500. He was backpedaling, struggling to get a new bolt into the thing so he could shoot me. I didn't slow down. When I was 10 yards away, he tossed the crossbow down, keeping the bolt in his hands to use as a weapon. Back behind me, toward the trail, I heard Beshi scream. But it didn't penetrate the rage haze through which all my thoughts were filtered. I wanted only one thing, and that was to kill Wayne. I wasn't thinking about finesse as I approached him. I wasn't thinking about anything but brute force. I slashed out with my pocket knife just as he plunged the crossbow bolt into my abdomen. One quick movement each, both lasting less than a second. We stumbled back from each other, my yell dying in my throat as my eyes went wide in surprise. For a second, nothing happened. We looked at each other like we'd just come out of a stupor, and we were seeing the world clearly again. I looked down at the bolt sticking out of my lower left abdomen. When I looked back up at Wayne, the wound I'd made in his throat was pouring blood. He put one hand to his throat, which was immediately covered in blood. Then he turned and lurched off into the forest, only making it 4 steps before he collapsed. Beshi was still screaming, and the noise finally got through to me. I turned around and ran back the way I'd come, slowing to pick up the crossbow from where Wayne had dropped it. As I moved, I flipped my knife closed and slipped it back into my pocket. I only recalled that Wayne had been wearing a quiver on his arm with extra bolts in it when I was approaching Roger's body. It was too late to go back. Beshi's screams were getting farther and farther away. Silently apologizing to my friend, I pulled the crossbow bolt out of him and continued toward the trail. Each step sent a jolt of pain up through my abdomen, but I didn't dare pull the bolt out of me. It didn't feel like it was very deep, but I knew enough about first aid to know that you weren't supposed to remove anything like that unless you could receive immediate medical attention. So I left it in as I ran toward the trail. When I got to the spot where I'd left Beshi, I didn't see her anywhere, but I could still hear her screams. They were coming from up the trail. I ran that way, realizing that Wayne hadn't been working alone. There was someone else out there. It was the only thing that made sense. After running for about 50 yards, I came to a straight stretch of trail and saw the person carrying Beshi. It was a man with greasy dark hair, wearing a camouflage t-shirt, jeans, and hiking boots. I couldn't see his face because his back was to me. He had Beshi slung over one shoulder and was hoofing it up the trail. I paused for long enough to put the bolt that had killed Roger into the crossbow, making it ready to fire. But I would have to get damn close to use it without the risk of hitting Beshi. All the running had jostled the bolt in my abdomen, and I could feel the blood soaking into my pants and underwear. My energy was flagging, my steps becoming less precise. The brief stop had given the guy enough time to get ahead of me again, and I could no longer see him on the trail. But Beshi was smart, and she kept screaming. When I came to the clearing where we'd first seen Beshi, I saw the man disappearing into the woods near the place where she had first emerged. I started that way, but before I'd gone more than 10 yards, Beshi suddenly stopped screaming. I couldn't see them because of the woods, but I figured the man had knocked her out or clamped a hand over her mouth. For all I knew, he'd killed her to shut her up. Although I hadn't seen him carrying any weapons, it didn't mean he wasn't armed. I slowed as I came to the edge of the woods. The sun was nearly down, and the woods were full of dark shadows. I trudged into them cautiously, scanning for any sign of movement. The loaded crossbow was heavy in my hands as I moved through the woods. I was losing strength about as fast as I was losing daylight. And as daylight faded, so did my chances of finding Beshi. He'd taken her and was going to do God knows what with her. I thought about turning around, about heading down the trail to my Suburban and taking myself to a hospital. Every step was widening the wound above my left hip. I headed toward the top of the gently sloping hill as the last of the day died slowly, killed by the encroaching night. It was full dark by the time I reached the top of the hill. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, thanks to the cloud cover and the trees blocking any light from the cosmos. I resisted the urge to take out my phone and use its flashlight function. I wanted my eyes to adjust. Finally, after several long minutes, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, allowing me to see about 20 feet in any direction. It wasn't much of an improvement, but it was something. I continued along the top of the wooded hill. The West Virginia mountains still loomed over me, only adding to the claustrophobia pressed upon me by the darkness. As I leaned against a dead oak tree to look down at my wound, I heard something off in the distance. It sounded like a door shutting. I moved toward where I thought the source of the sound was, soon seeing a large, dark square sitting in the distance. A house. A scream erupted from my right, sending my heart into my throat. I whipped the loaded crossbow that way, seeing a large woman with a cleaver running toward me. She screamed, her eyes bulging from between the folds of fat that encompassed her face. She wore a muumuu and moved quicker than her bulk should have allowed, holding the cleaver up, ready to strike. I pulled the trigger on the crossbow. The weapon kicked in my hands as the bolt sailed from the arrow track. Although I'd been aiming at her chest, the bolt entered her wide-open mouth, strangling her scream as it punched into the back of her throat. But she didn't stop. She didn't even slow. She kept coming. I backpedaled and ran into a tree trunk, bringing the crossbow up to ward off the cleaver. She was strong, and she chopped down on the crossbow, causing my arms to buckle. The top edge of the cleaver dug into my forehead and dragged down toward my nose. I struggled to get her off me as the cleaver tore my face open. I'm going to die, I thought. This woman's going to kill me. She kept pushing the cleaver, dragging it down my face. I screamed, and with that scream came a surge of anger-fueled energy. I rallied, surprised at my newfound strength as I pushed her away, causing her to fall onto her back. It seemed as though the severe damage of the injury was finally catching up to her. She dropped the cleaver and tried to pull the arrow out of her mouth, but it wouldn't budge. Still, she tried, writhing on the ground and coughing up blood around the carbon fiber bolt. Then she stilled, her hands falling away to flop on the ground like fleshy fish. I dropped to the ground nearby, huffing, the shock of the situation settling on me, threatening to take away my will. Blood was getting into my left eye from the wound down my face. I raised a hand and drew it down the wound, wincing at the pain. There was nothing I could do about it. Not yet. I thought about Norman and Roger, and about Beshi. I looked in the direction of the dark house. knowing that was where the man had taken Beshi. Wiping the blood off my hand, I struggled to my feet, noticing that the bolt Wayne had stabbed me with was on the ground nearby. It had fallen out in the struggle. I raised my shirt and saw that the wound was bleeding freely. The strength I'd found was gone, and I felt weaker than ever. There was no telling how much more blood I could lose before it became too much. I raised the crossbow, seeing that the woman had cut the string, making the weapon useless. I tossed it to the ground and grabbed the cleaver and the bolt that had been in me moments ago. Then I headed toward the dark house in the distance. As I came to the house, I realized it wasn't so much a house as an old log cabin. It barely looked habitable from the outside. There were tarps fastened around the place to keep rain out, and all the windows had been boarded up. A 30-year-old Ford truck sat on balding tires at the front of the house, like a horse waiting to be put down. A narrow and nearly overgrown dirt road wound through the trees. I listened hard at the front door, but I heard no movement from inside. I clamped the crossbow bolt in my right armpit to free my left hand. The knob rattled as I grabbed it. It turned freely in my hand, broken. A gentle push on the door had it opening like a gaping wound in a corpse. And like a corpse, the inside of the cabin reeked. It was pitch black inside. I peered into that darkness, hoping my eyes would adjust. The drip, drip, drip of blood falling off my chin and onto the wood floor seemed loud, like the second hand of a struggling clock ticking my life away. When it was clear my night vision wasn't going to cut it, I took the arrow from my armpit and set it on the floor. I pulled my phone out with my left hand and turned on the flashlight function. The inside of the cabin came alive like a crime scene under the flash from a technician's camera. The large room just inside the doorway was strewn with soda bottles, chip bags, and candy wrappers. There were soiled sleeping bags balled up here and there, next to stacks of tabloid magazines. Gripping the cleaver tighter, I moved into the cabin. The smell of putrid body odor permeated the place, clinging to the walls and floor like cigarette smoke. A fireplace sat cold on the right side of the room. Next to it was a rickety card table with some basic cooking supplies stacked on it. I noted the large 5-gallon water jug nearby. The place probably didn't have a kitchen or a bathroom. It was just a rudimentary structure, probably built for hunters. I figured these people were squatting in it. My light picked out a hallway at the back of the room. The hallway led to 3 doors, 2 on the right and 1 on the left, all of them closed. My blood drip, drip, dripped off my chin and onto the floor, accompanied by the harsh sound of my breathing. My palms were sweaty, and my head felt like it was filled with helium. I tried the first door on the right, shoving it open and raising the cleaver. My light picked out Beshi, lying limply on a holey blanket on the floor. Clothes were strewn around the small room, all of them too small for Beshi. They were children's clothes. As I rushed toward the girl, thinking only of getting her out of there, I noticed a figure standing in the corner to my right, on the same side as the door. It was just a glance out of the corner of my eye, but the alarm bell started blaring in my head. Unfortunately, the loss of blood had made me sluggish, and my reaction time wasn't great. As I turned toward the man, he was already rushing me, a large hunting knife plunging toward my throat. I whipped to my right, leading with the cleaver, simultaneously trying to hit him with my weapon and dodge away from the knife. He had his right hand up, so the sharp side of the cleaver sunk into his armpit just as the tip of his knife penetrated me above my left collarbone. We both jerked away from each other, taking our respective weapons with us. In the light from my phone, I saw that this man looked like an older and larger version of Wayne. He had less of a rat face, but I could see the resemblance. His brown eyes glared at me from under creased brows. His face twisted in a sneer as he jammed his left hand into his armpit. He was bleeding profusely, and his hand wasn't helping much. I backed up, hitting the wall, knowing I wasn't yet feeling the full effects of the wound he'd just inflicted. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then he charged me. I threw the cleaver at him, regretting the move as soon as it was out of my hand. He raised his right hand to ward off the blow as the thing spun once in the air. The blade sliced into his right wrist. He cried out and dropped the knife, then stumbled back and fell into the wall. The cleaver landed on the floor 6 inches from Beshi.
Son of a bitch!
The man said, looking at the gash in his right wrist. Blood was still pouring out of his armpit and down his left forearm. I guessed I'd hit an artery.
Son of a bitch!
He said again as he fell onto his side.
Fuck! I'm dying!
I tried to pick Beshi up, but I was too weak. I said her name and nudged her. After a moment, she woke up and looked at the man on the floor. His eyes stared blankly at her. I grabbed her hand and dragged her out of the room. But as we reached the front door, Beshi pulled away.
Wait!
She said.
No!
What? I asked. What is it? She hurried back into the cabin. When she reached the second door on the right in the hallway, she turned back and gestured to me. I followed her, now holding the wound above my collarbone with my right hand. She opened the door, revealing a narrow set of stairs into a cellar. We walked down together, and I gasped when I shone the light around. A dozen pairs of eyes stared back at me from the dark half-cellar. Holy God, I said, looking at all the children who were chained to each other in the dirty basement. They were all emaciated and wearing barely any clothes.
Help!
Beshi said, gesturing at the kids.
Please!
If the old Ford truck at the cabin hadn't worked, I would have died there from blood loss. As it happened, the truck did work. I made it to the outskirts of the nearest town before I passed out behind the wheel. Thankfully, Beshi was with me, and she flagged someone down. They got me to a hospital, saving my life. As soon as I was awake, I asked for the police. When an officer arrived, I told him about the kids still chained up at the cabin. I'd had to leave them there, knowing if I didn't get medical attention, I would have died. With Beshi's limited vocabulary, I didn't think she'd be able to tell the police about the cabin and the kids, and I was right. She'd been treated at the hospital for her wounds, given fluids in the first step on a long road back to health. But when questioned by police, she couldn't give them much. Thankfully, all the kids were okay when the police reached them, after I told them where to go. I was told later that all the kids had the same mother but different fathers. The two brothers, Wayne and Oliver, were the fathers. Together with the woman who tried to kill me with the cleaver, they'd made a sick little family together. It seemed they'd taken pleasure in torturing their children, beating them, starving them, and using them for their sick entertainment. I was hailed as a hero, a savior of 13 children in the papers. But I wasn't a savior. It was Roger and Norman who'd given their lives to help Beshi. They were the real saviors. I was just lucky to have such good friends. And I still think about them every day, but especially when I go hiking. These days, however, I bring a gun with me when I go out into the woods. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.